A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Have you ever looked at a modern skyscraper and wondered if the spot it is standing on will still be a city in 5,000 years? Most of our modern urban centers are toddlers compared to the real giants of history. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the 5 longest continuously inhabited cities in the world, and it really forces you to think about what permanent actually means.
It is a massive question, Corn. And honestly, it is one of the most debated topics in archaeology because the record-keeping 10,000 years ago was, well, non-existent. We are relying on carbon dating, soil strata, and broken pottery to piece together a timeline of who stayed where and for how long. By the way, a quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash for helping us script this deep dive today.
I like that we are using cutting-edge AI to talk about cities that were old when the pyramids were just a drawing on a piece of papyrus. But before we get into the list, Herman Poppleberry, we need to be clear about the rules. What counts as continuously inhabited? Because if everyone leaves for 100 years during a plague and then comes back, does the clock reset?
That is exactly the point of contention. Most historians define it as a settlement that has never been fully abandoned. There might be a massacre, a fire, or a drought that thins the population out, but as long as there is a heartbeat in the city, as long as someone is still living in those houses or trading in those streets, it counts. It is the difference between a city like Troy, which was destroyed and left as a ruin for centuries, and a city like Damascus, where people have been waking up and going to work every single day for thousands of years.
It is like the ship of Theseus, but with mud bricks and drainage systems. If you replace every person and every building over 10 millennia, is it still the same city?
In a cultural and geographic sense, yes. These places survive because they are sitting on top of something indispensable. Usually, it is water or a mountain pass that makes trade unavoidable. You can burn the buildings, but you cannot move the spring or the mountain.
All right, let's start the countdown. If we're looking at the oldest, we have to start with the heavyweight champion of the West Bank. Number 5 on most lists, though arguably number 1 depending on how you define city, is Jericho.
Jericho is fascinating because it breaks all the rules of how we think civilization started. Most people assume you need a massive empire to build a walled city, but the archaeological evidence at Tel es Sultan suggests people were living there permanently as far back as 9000 BCE. That is 11,000 years ago.
11,000 years. To put that in perspective, the Roman Empire ended about 1,500 years ago. We're talking about a gap that makes Rome look like a recent startup. What was the draw? Why did hunter-gatherers suddenly decide, you know what? This spot right here is where we stay forever?
The spring. It is called Ain es Sultan. It produces nearly 4,000 liters of water every single minute. In the middle of the Judean desert, that is more valuable than gold. If you have that much water, you can farm, you can keep livestock, and you never have to leave. But because you have something everyone else wants, you have to protect it. That is why we see the Tower of Jericho, which was built around 8000 BCE. It is an 8-meter tall stone structure. Think about the labor required to build that before the invention of the wheel or metal tools.
But wait, how do you even build an 8-meter tower without wheels or pulleys? That's like building a 3-story house by hand using nothing but rocks you found on the ground.
It's exactly that. They used internal staircases. Imagine carrying heavy stones up a narrow, dark, spiral staircase while the sun is beating down on the desert outside. It suggests a level of social organization we didn't think existed in the Neolithic. You need a foreman, you need designers, and you need a way to feed the workers who aren't out hunting because they're busy hauling rocks. Jericho wasn't just a village, it was a project.
It's the ultimate get off my lawn move. Building a massive stone tower just to make sure the neighbors don't steal your water. But Jericho isn't just a ruin, right? People are still living there today.
They are. It has moved slightly over the millennia, and the modern city sits adjacent to the ancient mound, but the habitation is continuous. What is wild is that archaeologists have found 20 successive settlements layered on top of each other. It's like a geological lasagna of human history. You dig down a few meters and you're in the Iron Age, a few more and you're in the Neolithic.
I wonder if the property taxes go down the deeper you go. Probably not. Let's move to number 4, which takes us to the coast of Lebanon. Byblos, or as the locals originally called it, Gebal.
Byblos is the quintessential commercial hub. If Jericho was about water, Byblos was about the sea. It's been settled since at least 5000 BCE, though some evidence points to 8000 BCE for the very first huts. But by the 3rd millennium BCE, it was a full-blown powerhouse.
This is where the name of the Bible comes from, right? I remember reading that the Greeks called it Byblos because that's where they got their papyrus.
Spot on. It was the primary port for trade between Egypt and the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were the masters of the sea, and Byblos was their crown jewel. They were exporting cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon to Egypt because Egypt has no big trees for ships, and importing papyrus in return. The Greeks bought so much papyrus from this specific port that the word for the book became Byblos.
But how did a small coastal town manage to hold on to that monopoly for so long? I mean, surely other ports wanted a piece of that Egyptian papyrus money.
It was the cedar. Byblos had the geographical keys to the kingdom. The mountains behind Byblos were covered in the famous cedars of Lebanon. If you were a pharaoh in Egypt and you wanted a solar boat or a grand palace, you needed that wood. Byblos controlled the output. They weren't just sailors, they were the middlemen for the most important construction material of the ancient world.
It is amazing how a logistics hub from 5,000 years ago still dictates the vocabulary we use for our most sacred texts today. What I find interesting about Byblos is how it survived the Sea Peoples and the collapse of the Bronze Age. So many cities around the Mediterranean just vanished during that period, but Byblos kept the lights on.
It's that Phoenician flexibility. They weren't just warriors, they were diplomats and merchants. When the Egyptians were strong, Byblos was an Egyptian outpost. When the Persians came, they traded with the Persians. When Alexander the Great showed up, they found a way to work with the Greeks. They made themselves too useful to destroy. That is a recurring theme in these ancient cities. To survive 10,000 years, you cannot be too stubborn. You have to be able to pivot.
Adapting or dying. It's a lesson for modern corporations, I suppose. If you can't pivot like a Phoenician sailor, you're going to end up like a ruin. Now, number 3 on our list takes us to Europe. Argos, in Greece.
This one usually surprises people because everyone thinks of Athens or Sparta when they think of ancient Greece. But Argos has been continuously inhabited since about 5000 BCE. While Athens was still a collection of small villages, Argos was already a major urban center in the Peloponnese.
Why don't we hear more about it? If it's the oldest city in Europe, why is it playing second fiddle to Athens in the history books?
Because Argos was the ultimate neutral power. During the Persian Wars, when Athens and Sparta were fighting for the soul of Greece, Argos stayed out of it. During the Peloponnesian War, they often tried to remain a third party. They didn't have the same glory as the military or philosophical centers, but they had something better, longevity. They stayed productive, they farmed the fertile Argive plain, and they just endured.
But surely being neutral makes you a target. If I'm a conqueror, I see a wealthy, neutral city and I think easy pickings. How did they fend off the bullies?
They were incredibly good at defensive architecture and diplomacy. They had the Larissa Citadel, a massive fortified hill that overlooked the city. Whenever things got too hot, the population would retreat up there. They also played the long game with their neighbors. They would wait for Athens and Sparta to exhaust themselves, and then Argos would emerge as the local power again. It's a strategy of conservation over expansion.
It's the boring strategy of city management. Don't get into big wars, keep the farms running, and don't let the city burn down. It's not a bad way to live for 7,000 years.
And if you visit Argos today, it is a living, breathing city. It isn't a museum. You see modern apartment buildings with balconies overlooking a Roman theater that was built on top of a Greek theater. The layers are everywhere. It's a bit messy, honestly. Modern infrastructure has to navigate around these unmovable historical sites. You can't just put in a subway line if you're going to hit a temple of Hera every 5 meters.
That has to be a nightmare for urban planners. Hey, we need to fix the sewer line. Sorry, you can't. That's where Agamemnon's cousin is buried.
It really is a constraint, but it's also a form of resilience. These cities have a sense of identity that is anchored in the deep past. It is hard to feel like a city is failing when it has already survived the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, the Roman conquest, the Byzantine era, and the Ottoman Empire.
All right, we are getting into the top two, and these two are often debated for the number one spot depending on who you ask. Number two is Aleppo in Syria.
Aleppo is heartbreaking to talk about because of the recent conflict, but historically, it is a titan. It's been inhabited since at least 4,300 BCE, but some archaeological sites like Tel Caramel nearby suggest people were in the area as early as 11,000 BCE. The city itself sits at the end of the Silk Road. It was the gateway to the east.
I've seen pictures of the citadel of Aleppo. It looks like something out of a fantasy novel. A massive fortress on a hill right in the middle of the city.
That hill is actually a tell, an artificial mound created by thousands of years of people building on top of the ruins of their ancestors. The citadel we see today is mostly medieval, but the ground it sits on has been used for defense since the 3rd millennium BCE. There is a temple to the storm god Hadad inside that citadel that dates back to the Bronze Age. Think about that. People were worshipping a storm god on that exact hill 5,000 years ago, and people were fighting to defend that same hill in the 21st century.
So, when we see a tell like that, we're basically looking at a mountain of trash and old houses.
Essentially, yes. In the ancient world, if your house fell down, you didn't haul the rubble away. You just leveled it off and built on top of it. Over thousands of years, the city literally rises into the sky. The citadel of Aleppo is one of the most impressive examples because it's so steep and perfectly circular. It's a man-made mountain of history.
It's the strategic value. Aleppo is the perfect crossroads between the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. If you want to move goods from China or India to Europe, you eventually had to pass through Aleppo. That trade creates a massive amount of wealth, which allows a city to rebuild after every disaster.
And that wealth attracts invaders. Aleppo has been conquered by the Hittites, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, Mongols, and Ottomans. The Mongols famously sacked it in the 13th century and piled up skulls, but the city still didn't die. Within a few decades, the markets were back open. The souks of Aleppo. The covered markets were some of the longest and oldest in the world until the recent civil war. They were the beating heart of the city's economy for centuries.
It's that commercial gravity again. Once a trade route is established, it's like a river. It's very hard to divert it. People go where the money is, and for 5,000 years the money was in Aleppo. Now, that brings us to the final entry on our list, which is often tied with Aleppo or Damascus. Let's talk about Damascus, the city of jasmine.
Damascus is frequently cited as the oldest capital city in the world. Like Aleppo, it has a firm date of at least 4,300 BCE, but many archaeologists believe it goes back much further. The Barada River is the reason Damascus exists. It creates an oasis in a very dry region.
It's the same story as Jericho, just on a larger scale. Water equals life. But Damascus feels like it has a different kind of prestige. It wasn't just a trade hub, it was a political center for almost its entire history.
It became the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate in the 7th century, which stretched from Spain to India. But even before that, it was a major center for the Aramaeans and the Romans. The street called Straight, which is mentioned in the New Testament, still exists in the Old City. You can walk the same path today that people walked 2,000 years ago.
Wait, the street is actually still there? Like, the same layout?
The exact same layout. It's called Bab Sharchi today. It's a long, straight road that cuts through the old city. If you look at an aerial map, you can see the Roman grid system still dictating where the shops are. It's a living fossil of Roman urban planning. You have people selling modern electronics and spices in buildings that are often built on Roman foundations.
That is what blows my mind. We talk about history, as something that happened in the past. But in Damascus or Aleppo, the past is just the basement of the house you're living in. It's continuous. There's no break. Herman, why did these 5 cities survive while others like Babylon or Nineveh or Carthage fell? Those were massive, wealthy cities. Why are they ruins while Byblos is still a port?
That is the million-dollar question for urban historians. If you look at Babylon, it relied on a very complex irrigation system that required a strong central government to maintain. When the government collapsed or the rivers shifted their course, the city couldn't breathe. It choked to death. But the cities on our list, Jericho, Byblos, Argos, Aleppo, Damascus, they are all built on natural advantages that don't require a king to maintain.
The spring at Jericho doesn't care who's in charge. The port at Byblos is always going to be the shortest path for a boat.
Precisely. They have passive survival traits. Also, size might have played a role. Babylon was a megacity of its time. When you have hundreds of thousands of people in one spot, you are vulnerable to famine and plague. The 5 oldest cities were often smaller, more manageable urban centers for much of their history. They were human scale long before that was a buzzword in urban planning.
But what about the cultural aspect? Does a city need a myth to survive? Like, do people stay because they believe the city is special?
That's where the soul of the city comes in. If a city is just a place to make money, people leave when the money dries up. But if it's a place of worship or a cultural touchstone, they stay. Look at Varanasi in India. It often makes these lists. Sometimes people put it at number 1. It's been settled since at least 3000 BCE. It doesn't have a major trade route or a strategic fortress. It's a spiritual center.
Varanasi is a great example of cultural resilience. If a city is considered sacred, people will return to it no matter what. You can burn Varanasi to the ground, but as long as the Ganges River is flowing, the Hindus will come back to bathe in it. The city exists because of an idea, not just a resource. That is a different kind of longevity. It's not about the economy, it's about the soul of a civilization.
Here is a fun fact. Varanasi is also known as the City of Light, and Mark Twain once said it is older than history, older than tradition, older even than legend, and looks twice as old as all of them put together. Even in the 1800s, people were struck by its sheer age. It's that sense of being outside of time.
So we have 3 main drivers for urban immortality: water, trade, and faith. If you have one of those, you might last 1,000 years. If you have 2, you're looking at 5,000. If you have all 3, you're basically Damascus.
And it makes you look at our modern cities differently. Think about a city like Phoenix, Arizona. It exists because of massive air conditioning systems and water piped in from hundreds of miles away. It's a high-maintenance city. If the power grid goes down for a month, Phoenix becomes uninhabitable. But Damascus? If the power goes out, the Barada River is still there. People will keep living.
We've traded resilience for comfort. These ancient cities are the ultimate survivors because they are fundamentally tied to the earth in a way we aren't anymore. Herman, what are the practical takeaways here? If I'm a city planner in 2026, what am I learning from Jericho?
The first takeaway is water security. We talk about it all the time, but the history of these cities proves that water is the only thing that actually matters in the long run. If your water source is artificial or vulnerable, your city has an expiration date.
And the second is mixed-use development, but on a millennial scale. These cities weren't zoned into residential and commercial areas. They were organic. People lived above their shops, and their shops were next to the temple, and the temple was next to the wall. That density creates a social fabric that is very hard to tear.
It also makes the city walkable by default. In Aleppo before the war, you could walk across the entire old city in 20 minutes. Everything you needed, food, religion, work, entertainment, was within that radius. That creates a level of social cohesion that suburban sprawl just can't match. When you see your neighbors every single day in the market, you're more likely to help them when the city is under siege.
The third takeaway is the value of heritage as a pillar of resilience. When a city has a deep history, the people who live there feel a sense of stewardship. They aren't just residents, they're the latest chapter in a very long book. That makes them more likely to stay and rebuild after a disaster. In modern disposable cities, if things get bad, people just move to the next suburb. But you don't just move from a city that has been there for 10,000 years. You stay and you fix it.
There's a psychological term called place attachment. In these ancient cities, place attachment is off the charts. It's not just where you live, it's who you are. Your identity is tied to the stones of the street.
It's a sense of belonging that transcends the individual. I think that's something we've lost in a lot of our modern development. Everything is built to last 30 years, not 3,000. We build malls that are dated in a decade, while the markets in Aleppo were relevant for 1,000 years.
There was a certain humility in these ancient cities too. They weren't trying to conquer nature, they were trying to sit within it. They followed the contours of the hills and the flow of the springs. We try to flatten everything and force the environment to adapt to us. But nature always wins in the end. The cities that survived are the ones that made peace with the geography.
I'm also thinking about the digital version of this. We talked about ancient backups in a previous life, but how do we ensure our digital cities, our platforms, and data have this kind of longevity? Is it even possible?
It's a struggle because digital infrastructure is the definition of high maintenance. It requires constant energy and hardware updates. If we want our digital legacy to last 10,000 years, we need to find the digital equivalent of a natural spring, something that doesn't require us to keep the lights on manually.
Maybe it's decentralized protocols, something that exists as long as there are two computers talking to each other, like the Phoenician trade routes. If you can't kill the route, you can't kill the city.
That is a great analogy. The protocol is the geography. If the protocol is useful, people will keep using it, and the city built on top of it will survive. But even then, you need digital maintenance. You need people to keep the servers running, just like the people of Jericho had to keep the spring clear of silt.
It always comes back to the people. You can have the best spring in the world, but if the people decide to leave, the city dies. These 5 cities are proof that people can be incredibly stubborn when they find a place they love.
Stubbornness is an underrated virtue in urban history.
Well, I, for one, am going to start looking at my local park's water fountain with a lot more respect. It might be the only reason this place is still here in the year 7000.
It's a humbling perspective. We are just passing through. These cities are the real protagonists of human history. We are just the extras in the background of their story.
That's a bit dark, Herman Poppleberry. I like to think I'm at least a supporting character. Maybe the guy who sells the papyrus.
You'd definitely be the guy making jokes about the papyrus.
Guilty as charged. This has been a fascinating look at how to stay relevant for 10 millennia. I think the secret is basically find water, be nice to merchants, and don't pick fights you can't win.
Simple in theory, incredibly difficult in practice. But these 5 cities proved it can be done. They survived the Bronze Age collapse, the rise and fall of Rome, the Black Death, and the Industrial Revolution. They are the ultimate anti-fragile systems.
I wonder what the next 5,000 years will look like for them. Will Damascus still be there when we're colonizing Mars?
I'd bet on it. If I had to pick which would last longer, a colony on Mars or the city of Damascus, my money is on the Barada River. It's had a much longer track record.
Thanks for the deep dive, Herman. And thanks to Daniel for the prompt. It really puts the modern world in perspective when you realize Damascus was already old when the concept of modern didn't even exist.
It really does. Thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping us on track.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. If you want to dive deeper into the history of these cities, we've got some resources and maps over at myweirdprompts.com.
We're also on Telegram if you want to get notified when we drop new episodes. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
That's it for us today. Stay curious and maybe go visit a city that's older than your country. It's good for the soul.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
Goodbye. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth